All right, let's just jump right in. Have you ever listened to someone who's super polished, super confident, but something feels off? And then someone else, maybe a little clumsy with their words, says something that just rings true? Well, we're going to break down a fascinating treatise by Alan Spedding that gets into this exact paradox. How simple, even rough presentations of truth can sometimes be way more powerful than the most eloquent arguments out there.
And this gets right to the heart of the puzzle. It's a total head scratcher, right? On one side, you've got everything we're told to admire, someone who's articulate, educated, confident. But they can be dead wrong. And on the other side, you've got someone who maybe doesn't seem all that impressive, who might even stumble over their words. And yet, they're the one who's right. So how on earth does that work? That's the big question we're tackling today.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll get into that contradiction itself. Then, we'll define the two big ideas clashing here, intellectualism and simplicity. After that, we'll look at the main case study from the source, Joseph Smith, and see how revelation is presented as the answer to this whole puzzle. And finally, we'll wrap it all up with what this means for us when we're trying to figure out what's true and what's not. Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, the puzzling contradiction. This is where we really start to pull apart this idea that just because something sounds good doesn't mean it is good or true. You know, this quote from the source just nails it. It sets up this incredible tension between what the world sees as credible and what the scriptures point to as a different pattern altogether. The author brings up two perfect examples to frame this. Corey Hoare, a character from the Book of Mormon who was brilliant at persuading people against belief, and then you have Joseph Smith, who often called himself unlearned and rough, but who delivered profound truths. They are the two sides of this coin. So now that we feel that tension, let's move on to Section 2. Intellectualism versus simplicity. To really get what the source is arguing, we have to understand how it defines these two very different ways of thinking. Now, here's what's so interesting. The source doesn't say intellectualism is bad. Not at all. It loves complexity, it loves deep analysis, it loves things that are provable, but, and this is a huge but, the author points out a major danger: pride. The risk of looking at something that can't be neatly explained by logic and just dismissing it out of hand. And on the flip side, we have what the source calls gospel simplicity. And this is so key. This is not about being ignorant or thinking shallowly. It's really about a kind of humility, an openness, being receptive to truth no matter what kind of package it shows up in. It's about being willing to see things with fresh eyes. And get this, according to the treatise, this isn't just a random occurrence. It's a deliberate pattern woven throughout Scripture. The source brings up some amazing examples. Paul's letter saying God chose the foolish things to confound the wise. Or think about the story of the brass serpent. The command was just to look, but it was so simple that people refused to do it. Or Naaman, this powerful military guy who was offended at the idea of just washing in a muddy river. The point the author makes is that these simple tests are like a filter designed to expose our own pride. Which brings us right to Section 3 and the source's main event, the case of Joseph Smith. He's presented as the ultimate example of this whole principle, the so-called unlearned prophet. And you can just see the pattern play out so clearly here. The author walks us through it. It all starts with a simple, honest question from a teenager. Which church is right? And the result is a world-changing vision. Then you have this same kid, an untrained farm boy, dictating the Book of Mormon, a book that's incredibly complex in its doctrine. And later he gives this famous sermon, the King Follett Discourse, where he uses just plain, everyday language to lay out these mind-bending doctrines about the nature of God that people are still unpacking today. This quote just sums it all up, doesn't it? It perfectly captures that paradox. The source paints him as this person who could bridge both worlds. He could talk to a farmer in a way that made perfect sense, and then turn around and hold his own with scholars on these incredibly deep subjects. Okay, so we've got this major conflict between worldly polish and simple truth. How do we make sense of it? Well, that's what we get into in Section 4, Revelation, which the source presents as the great equalizer. Which really brings us to the biggest question of all. What could possibly connect something as simple as a child's faith with something as deep as complex philosophy? And after all that buildup, the source gives us this powerful one-word answer: revelation. So here's the real game changer. The author is arguing that revelation flips the script entirely. It says humility is more important than a fancy degree. It's the one thing that makes profound truth available to anyone and everyone, not just the people who are good with words or have a lot of schooling. It takes truth out of the hands of performers and anchors it to something divine. All right, let's bring it all home. Our final section is the takeaway. How do we actually use this idea to discern truth for ourselves, to look past all that surface level polish? So what does this all mean for you and me? Well, the source leaves us with a few big ideas. First, it's a huge reminder that confidence and eloquence do not equal truth. Second, we should really be judging a message by what's in it, not how pretty the wrapping paper is. And that means we might need a totally different set of glasses than the ones the world hands us to judge credibility. And finally, the source suggests it all comes down to humility. That's what lets us see wisdom in places where our pride might only see something foolish. And that leaves us with this final thought, a really provocative question to chew on. How often do we write off a message just because we don't like the messenger? And if we do that, how much truth are we missing out on, simply because it didn't arrive in the slick, impressive package we were expecting?